I never imagined I would find myself in such a situation. It all started innocently enough, as these things often do. When I married my husband 2 years ago, I knew I would be stepping into a new role as a stepmother to his teenage son, Kyle. He was 19 when I first met him, a bit reserved and guarded, but we got along well. I always tried my best to respect his space, while offering support when he needed it. As time went on, I saw Kyle growing into a confident young man. He was pursuing his college degree and seemed focused on his future. I always admired how determined and ambitious he was. He reminded me a lot of his father, especially when he was deep in thought. Our relationship, while not very close, was cordial and friendly. We kept things light. And I always viewed him as my husband's son, nothing more, nothing less. However, recently, things started to change. Kyle had been coming home from college more frequently, spending more time with us, and engaging me in conversation more than usual. It was nice to bond with him, but something about his demeanor began to feel different. At first, I dismissed it as a normal shift, considering he was maturing and trying to connect with his family in a more meaningful way. But there was one evening that changed everything. It was a quiet Friday night. My husband was working late at the office, and I had settled into the living room reading a book. Kyle came in from his room and sat down across from me. His presence wasn't unusual. We had spent quiet evenings like this before. But tonight there was an energy about him that made me feel slightly on edge. He was unusually chatty, asking about my day, my work, and then the conversation shifted. Kyle leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine, with an intensity I haven't seen before. "You know," he started, his voice low and steady, "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but I could sense that it wasn't just a casual conversation. Something more profound was bubbling beneath the surface. I gave him a curious look, trying to mask my unease. "What do you mean, Kyle?" I asked, hoping he'd clarify, and that I was just overthinking things. Kyle smiled slightly, as if he knew something I didn't. "I mean, us, you and me, we've been spending more time together, and I've noticed how easy it is to talk to you." He paused for a second before adding, "It feels different from before." His words caught me off guard. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was implying. I sat up straighter, attempting to keep things casual. "Well, I'm glad we've been able to connect more, Kyle. It's nice having you around." But he didn't stop there. Instead, he leaned forward even more, his tone soft yet direct. "It's more than that," he said. "You're not just Dad's wife to me. You're someone I look up to. Someone I've been thinking about more lately, in ways I'm not sure I should be." There it was. The weight of his words landed like a ton of bricks. I felt a mixture of shock and disbelief wash over me. What was he saying? I could feel my heart race as I processed his confession, but I had to stay calm. I couldn't allow this conversation to spiral any further. "Kyle," I said, "family. I'm your stepmother and I care about you. But I think you're misunderstanding something here. We've always had a friendly relationship, and I'm happy about that, but we can't blur those lines. It wouldn't be right." I hoped my words would bring clarity, help him see the gravity of the situation. But instead of backing off, Kyle gave me a half smile. "I get it," he said, his voice still calm, but that doesn't change how I feel. I stood up, trying to create some distance, needing to break the strange tension that had settled over the room. "Kyle, listen," I said, my tone more assertive. "Now you're confused. These feelings will pass. You're just going through a lot." But he didn't seem fazed. Instead, he stood up, to stepping closer than I was comfortable with. "What if I don't want them to pass?" he asked, his eyes never leaving mine. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "Kyle, this is inappropriate," I said firmly. "I need you to understand that." His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he would apologize, or at least recognize the situation for what it was. But then, he made a bold move that left me completely stunned. He reached out and gently took my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. I pulled away instinctively, shocked by the boldness of the gesture. "Kyle, this has to stop," I said, my voice now trembling, with both confusion and frustration. "We can't go down this road ever." Kyle didn't push further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't entirely convinced. He gave me a slow nod, his face unreadable, and then walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking and unsure of what had just happened. The rest of the night was a blur. I sat alone in the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing with questions, confusion, and even a bit of guilt. Did I do something to lead Kyle on? Did I miss signs that something like this was coming? No matter how many times I replayed our past interactions, nothing stood out to me. It had always been innocent. Or so I thought. When my husband came home later that evening, I felt a strange weight on my chest. I tried to act normal, but the unsettling encounter with Kyle was all I could think about. I didn't know if I should tell him. How could I, when I wasn't even sure how to process it myself? Over the next few days, I did everything in my power to avoid being alone with Kyle. I kept my conversations with him short and polite, focusing on trivial topics and refusing to engage in anything deeper. I thought that maybe if I gave him some space, this strange tension would dissipate and things could return to normal. But Kyle was persistent, even though I was pulling away. He didn't seem to notice or care. If anything, he seemed more determined to spend time with me. He found excuses to be in the same room, asking me questions, offering to help with things around the house. His attention felt heavy, and every time we were alone, I could feel him watching me, waiting for something, as if the situation between us hadn't already crossed a dangerous line. One evening, while my husband was in the shower and I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Kyle walked in. I didn't even need to look up to know it was him. I could feel his presence immediately. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken tension. "Can we talk?" Kyle asked, his voice soft but insistent. I kept my focus on chopping vegetables, trying to keep my hands steady. "There's nothing to talk about, Kyle," I replied firmly, hoping to end the conversation before it started. "We've already discussed this." Kyle didn't take the hint. He stepped closer, his voice more serious. "Now I can't just pretend that nothing happened. You know that too, right?" I felt a wave of frustration and panic rising within me. I put the knife down and turned to face him. "Kyle, nothing happened," I said, my voice sharp. "We talked, that's it. And we are never going to have this conversation again." He frowned as if he didn't believe me. "But I can see it in your eyes," he whispered. "You're trying to fight it. But I know you feel something too." My heart raced at the implication of his words, but I refused to let it show. "Kyle, you're wrong," I said coldly. "There is nothing between us, and there never will be. This needs to stop now." Before Kyle could say anything else, my husband walked into the kitchen, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. He greeted us both casually, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I felt a surge of relief, but also fear. I knew this wasn't over, and the more Kyle pushed, the harder it would become. To keep my husband in the dark, Kyle wasn't giving up, and his bold move had already thrown my world off balance. The following week was a mental battleground for me. Every moment I spent near Kyle felt like walking on thin ice. I became hyper-aware of his presence in the house. His footsteps, his glances, the way he seemed to linger in doorways, just a little too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing me, waiting for me to slip to let my guard down. I knew that I had to draw a firm line, one that left no room for ambiguity, but I was also terrified of how far things had already escalated. I debated telling my husband the truth, but I hesitated. How would he react? Would he be furious at Kyle? Or worse, would he think that I somehow encouraged this? One afternoon, while my husband was out running errands, Kyle came home early from his classes. I was in the living room, trying to relax with some television. But as soon as I heard the door open, my body tensed. He walked in, casually sitting down on the couch beside me, too close for comfort. I didn't acknowledge him at first, hoping he would sense my discomfort and leave, but instead he leaned back and spoke, his voice soft but direct. "You've been avoiding me," he said. His eyes focused on the TV, but I could feel his attention on me. I sighed, keeping my gaze forward. "Kyle, I've been giving you space. It's for the best." He shifted his tone, more serious. "Now it's not space I need, though. I need you to be honest with me. I know I made things awkward, but you can't just pretend like none of this is real." I turned to face him, feeling a surge of frustration. "Kyle, I am being honest. There is no this. What you're feeling, it's not real. It's just confusion, and I understand that. You're going through a lot right now, but we need to move on." Kyle didn't budge. His expression hardened and he leaned closer, his voice low and intense. "You can say whatever you want, but I know you're holding back. I see the way you look at me when you think no one's watching." My heart skipped a beat. Was I giving off the wrong signals without realizing it? I was angry at the suggestion, but also scared. "Kyle, you're crossing a line," I said, standing up, needing to put some distance between us. But Kyle stood too, moving toward me, his boldness rattling me to the core. "Maybe I am," he said softly. "But I don't care anymore. I'm done pretending like this doesn't mean something." I backed up, my voice shaking with both fear and resolve. "This ends now, Kyle. I don't care what you think is happening, but you have to stop this. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to tell your father." That seemed to stop him in his tracks. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He stepped back, his expression torn between frustration and something else I couldn't quite read. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded, but the intensity in his eyes hadn't faded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll back off, but don't think this is over." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there trembling, unsure if I had really put an end to it, or if I had just delayed something inevitable. Either way, I knew that the line had been drawn. Whether or not Kyle would respect it was another matter entirely. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a flood of conflicting emotions relief. Fear and guilt I had dodged a disaster, but the tension in our home remained, like a ticking time bomb. One wrong move could destroy everything. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you like this content.